What does an ancient ziggurat have to do with flaming tongues and the internet and AI? Find out in today's episode of The Current. Welcome back. Welcome back to The Current. This is Chris Nafis, pastor of Living Water Church, as always, and today you're stuck with just me. I want to thank all the people that have come on as guests over the last season here, and I've got some more guests lined up in the future, but I have, thankfully, I think, had some people asking to jump back into Acts, which is what we're doing here today. I also want to pause just for a moment and thank a couple people that have been helpful in getting this whole thing together. First, my brother Joe, who is a professional videographer and photographer out in Thailand, and he's been just volunteering to help me edit these videos. So thank you, Joe. Really appreciate it. And also I want to thank the Seligman brothers. Many of folks in Living Water know John Seligman, who leads worship for us. His brother Josh Seligman, who I've known from passing the church, now lives in the UK. Both of them have contributed to that little music snippet that we have at the beginning and the end of the episodes. Josh wrote a worship song that we sing in our church, and it comes from that. He gave us permission to use it, even though it turns out the melody was from a folk song. And John recorded that little bit for us. So thank you, Seligman brothers. Very appreciative of you for that, for way more than that. You all have been an important part of my life, and especially John as a deep part of Living Water. Thanks for all that you do. All right, we're jumping back into Acts. Today we're in Acts 2. The disciples, the apostles, have been waiting in Jerusalem as Jesus told them. Jesus has ascended, and they've replaced Judas as one of the apostles, who, as after Judas, died, and they cast lots and they found a new apostle. And today is one of the big days in the book of Acts, the day of Pentecost. Okay, so what happens at Pentecost? I'm not going to read the story. You can read it. It's in Acts 2, 1 through 13. I think we're going to spend 2 episodes talking about this. But everybody's waiting, right? And the Spirit descends. They hear this sound of a violent rushing wind. They see divided tongues of fire, flaming tongues, which I've always been curious what those flaming tongues look like. We talked about this in Bible study a few years ago, and I remember Kurt Kellogg saying he was thinking of like licks of fire, which I had always thought of like a literal pink tongue. It says they're divided tongues, so maybe they're like snake tongues or something of fire. I don't know what that looked like exactly, but it had to have been unusual, to say the least. Anyway, these tongues of fire descend. The apostles begin to speak. Most of them are from Galilee, which means they have an accent. For us, it would be kind of like having like a southern accent, like someone from, I don't know, Alabama, Louisiana, something like that. And all of a sudden, these guys are speaking, and there's Jews from all over the world there. They're gathered for the Festival of Weeks, which is a sort of a pilgrimage gathering. And the Jews, after the exile, have kind of spread across the entire region. And all these Jews who have spent years, generations even, in foreign places, they're back in Jerusalem to celebrate this festival. And they begin to hear these Galileans speaking, but they hear it in their own language. And we'll get to Peter's sermon in the future, and he begins to preach the gospel. But it's just kind of this amazing happening. Peter, someone accuses them of being drunk, and they say, well, it's only 9 a.m., right? They're not drunk, at least not yet. And so, what do we make of it? It's a wild story with all kinds of symbolism, all kinds of like interesting and exciting facts. And I think in order to make sense of it fully, we've got to start by going backwards. And we've got to go backwards to the Tower of Babel story. And hopefully this will connect as we get through our time here. But a lot of what's going on, some of the imagery points back to like a sort of a reversal of the Tower of Babel incident, which I'll tell again. You can find that also in Genesis 11. It's an interesting story. You've probably heard it before. And it's not just like an historic story, which maybe it is. It's a story for today, right? These stories in Scripture are not written to be historical accounts. Like that's not their primary purpose. Isn't just to be, hey, this is what happened. It's a recording of what happened, so that we can put it in the history books or whatever. I do believe that these stories are at least rooted in actual history. I don't know that they happen sort of literally as they're laid out in the Scriptures. For example, there's lots of Scriptures that are like quoting someone like Abraham. Did he say those exact words? I'm not sure. I think they're saying things in a way that's probably has a more broad meaning than that. And their primary purpose is, again, not to communicate the history specifically to like log the history in a way that we might think is important today, but they're written for the present in every age in history. They're written for us now to speak to us in our contemporary time about the things that we face. So you've probably heard the Tower of Babel story before. This is early on. This is the end of sort of the extended fall narrative in Genesis. This is Noah's already happened, right? We've got Adam and Eve, we've got Cain and Abel, we've got Lamech, we've got Noah, and then we get eventually to this Tower of Babel story where humanity they all speak one language, and they come together and they say, hey, we've got to make a name for ourselves. They start building bricks. They say, we're going to make a name for ourselves. If we don't make a name for ourselves, if we don't do something great ourselves, then we're going to be scattered all over the earth. And so in an attempt to remain unified, kind of ironically, they build this giant tower, which most scholars and historians believe to be a ziggurat. At least that's what the text is referring to, which were these ancient worship sites that they would build these really big towers for the time. For us, they wouldn't be that big. For their time, they were very big, with a big staircase going up. And at the top, they would have sort of a banquet table, and they would put essentially sacrifices up there. They put food and things up there that they believed the gods would come down and eat. And it was a way of kind of like offering something to the gods, right? And so they build this ziggurat, which you can Google it and you can look up. They have like sketches and stuff. It's interesting to see what it looks like. Again, it's just like a big giant spiral staircase into the sky. And, God comes down in the story and looks around, says, man, these humans, like if they're going to be able to accomplish anything, if we don't stop them, they speak the same language, they're all unified, and God decides to scatter them across the face of the earth, mix up their languages, and that's the Genesis account of like sort of how humanity spread over the face of the earth. Now, again, I don't think it's that important. I don't want to get into the debate about if this is like a literal story or if this is a figurative story or whatever, but this is a story that speaks to us very profoundly even now. When humans get tremendous power, we tend to use it for our own destruction. The text says nothing will be impossible for them now, right? Like this is something that many humans and kind of humanity and the sciences, like we're kind of striving for that now. Like we want nothing to be impossible. We want to be able to travel to Mars and to the ends of the universe. We want to be able to produce energy that is bottomless. And we want to be able to like communicate with anyone in any language. We want to be able to we want to fly, right? We want to do anything, right? What this story tells us is kind of puts that impulse in check a little bit, right? Like maybe it would be better if we could do less than we can do now, right? God scatters the language, as this continuation of the fall story, as they get kicked out of the garden and they kind of move east and east and east. They have the flood. The story kind of completes that sort of fall narrative where this is sort of the final great act of humanity's pride and of their fall is to try to build this great tower, which again may have had something to do with worship, but it was ultimately, at least as the text describes it, a tower that's meant to make a name for humanity, to kind of demonstrate the power of humanity. And God kind of says, this isn't good. This is not good. They're going to be able to do anything, which again, I think in our contemporary time, we hear that like, they can do anything as a good thing. And God sees it obviously as a bad thing. Because as humanity, at least part of what tempts us and what drives us, what pulls us into our own, like hubris and ultimately toward our own destruction, what sends us scattering apart from one another, even when we're trying to do things that unify us, things that are these things that we build to try to give ourselves a name, right? And some of them, like we might even be building in order to unify us again, right? Like think about the internet. In my sort of life so far, and maybe there's other things coming down the pipe that are bigger. I think the most revolutionary thing that's happened is the advent, the spread of the internet, and that involves smartphones and all those kinds of things. But the internet is sort of behind at least a significant part of all of that kind of communication expansion. And I think the impulses for developing, giving everyone access to the internet. I mean, all these things, like they're good ultimately. Like that's the motivation for most of the people driving this stuff, I think. I guess I kind of hope, is something good to unify, to cross bridges. It is kind of amazing that I can watch a video on Twitter or whatever of something dramatic happening on the other side of the world in another language, and I can see it in real time. I can hear people from that place commenting on it without any kind of filter. I mean, it does bridge these gaps. It gives us access. It gives us a voice. It kind of unifies us in this certain way. At the same time, we're more divided than probably ever. There's more potential for violence than ever. There's wars happening all over the world. There's political, anywhere that people kind of dig in and get in deep into internet culture. It seems like the ways that the tools that we've built and the ways that we've platformed things, they tend to drive wedges between us to the point where it feels like we are, and I think this was at its peak so far, at least in COVID, it felt like we were living in completely different realities than people who are even down the street from us, right? So this tool that we built, that humanity built, I didn't build it, but humanity built to try to, at least in an attempt to unify us, to do this great thing, to make information accessible to everyone all the time. I mean, I can Google, I have a random factual question. I can just pop it into the internet. I'll get, 100 answers. I'll be able to find information that I never could have found before. The other day, there was a song on and I was trying to figure out if it was a certain band and just hit my phone and it told me what the song was and who they are. I mean, it's amazing. When I was a little small, we couldn't do that. You had to wait till you heard it again, ask everyone you knew, do you know who sings this song, and try to figure it out. Now we can have access to all this information, all this stuff, but at the same time as it's sort of been this act of greatness, this great thing that humanity has done, it has in some ways scattered us, right? It's divided us. It's led us to deep conflicts to one another, not only to the point where we disagree with one another, but where it feels like we actually experience a different reality than someone else. Whereas some of us felt like we were in lockdown in a pandemic and the world was collapsing, and other people thought, this is all a scam. And you know what I mean? Like there's these ways that I don't have to explain it to you all. I think right? We live in these echo chambers and in these mirrors, and we just see sort of in our own divided way. And I think this, like the Tower of Babel story, this is part of why these stories in Scripture are so powerful, is because they really do bring something out of this experience that we do generation after generation. We try to make something great. We make this great technological advance, and it has this way of sort of destroying us, right? I think AI, this is the current thing right now, is AI is being developed. It's being pitched as this next great thing. It's going to be the thing that like revolutionizes everything. I've heard some people talking about how this could end up being humanity's sort of greatest achievement, that we are like midwifing a new age of existence where the machines will like be alive or something like that. I don't know. The overwhelming sentiment is that like this AI sort of revolution is on the way. It's going to happen. I don't think anyone knows what it's going to look like. But, it's kind of like if you read the story of Babel, if you look at human history, it should bring us some pause and say like, well, what are we doing here? Is this good? How is this going to divide and destroy us? How is our ability to make this great thing, which we have, partly because of the giftedness that God's given us, the intelligence that we have, the unity? I mean, these things take collaboration to build. That's part of the issue right now, I think, in the slowing down of AI, is that there's people in some countries that are really good at making these chips, and there's people in other countries that have developed coding, and they're kind of organizing all of that stuff. But what ways? I mean, it's not that hard for many of us to imagine the ways that this could go very wrong. I mean, I heard an interview with one of the early developers of AI at Google, who's kind of been going around blowing the alarm whistles that like the U.S. Defense Department early on, maybe like 6-7 years ago, before any of this was like big news, tried to buy Google's AI to put it on attack drones. Like they wanted to put this AI onto flying machines that would guide themselves and have bombs on them, which I'm like, have any of these people ever watched any sci-fi movie before? You get like rudimentary artificial intelligence, and the first thing you want to do is arm it and send it flying into the air. And they didn't do it, thankfully, but like there are people who are going to do that, right? And one of the things that we can pull out of that Babel story is that we have this temptation, this pull that just drives us to, like, we can't stop. We can't stop. And I think the sentiment today is that like, well, someone's going to do the next big AI thing. Someone's going to develop the next stage. And so if someone's going to do it, then it should be us. It should be me. I can be more responsible. And we have this sort of pride that if America's the one that develops it, then we'll at least use it well instead of some other country using it. And I think, like there's no humility in our collective drive towards greatness. And we're incapable of self-restraint as a species. And, so there's a sense, well, we might as well push it and we'll work out the consequences later. And I think the Tower of Babel serves as this warning. Watch out. It might not end the way that you want it to end. You might think this thing is going to, make it so no one has to work anymore. But, what history shows us is that like usually it's the people who own everything that benefit from those kinds of revolutionary designs. Like when robots get into the workplace, the ones who own all the capital are the ones that get rewarded for it. And the poor folks just lose their jobs and fall into poverty. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. And I don't want to be the boogeyman. Like it's coming. But I think we can learn at least some sense of like warning that, hey, maybe this isn't where we should put all of our effort and energy. And maybe as followers of God, as Christians, maybe there are some ways that we can maybe temper it a little bit, or at least invest ourselves elsewhere, because this is a trap that humanity falls into over and over again, right? The internet's going to connect us all, and it drives us to hate one another, to complete isolation and loneliness, to what feels like living in different realities than one another, but we can't seem to stop, right? Like we're all on the internet. I'm doing this on the internet right now. We feel like we need the tools and the information and the connection. It's like we have an addiction as a species that we're like powerless against, that we have to seek any power that we can have. And once we have it, we can't give it up, and we can't sort of not use it unless there's some force in place. So you can talk about nuclear energy, you can talk about industrial revolution, you can talk about like lots of things over the course of history that have had this same dynamic. So Babel tells this story of sort of human attempt to make themselves great, and God scattering and humbling and mixing up languages, right? And what we get in the story of Pentecost is almost a reversal of that, right? Like if Jesus is the new Adam and we have sort of a new ability to relate to God, a way of being that hasn't fallen into the way of sin. There's a new way where we can actually love one another and be the people that God made us to be, that God wants us to be. This is almost like another bookend of that story where like, Babel is the end of that fall narrative. And so in some ways it's not the end. The fall narrative continues on all the way till today, but it's the end of the sort of the height of the fall narrative in Genesis, because from there we begin the Abraham story. The Pentecost story is kind of the end of that undoing of the fall narrative, that there is a hope in something beyond, where God regathers the people. I mean, that's literally what's happened, is that God has used this Jewish festival to regather Jews who've been scattered all over the area, all over the region, all over the world, really. And if you read the text, you get a list of all these different places that people are coming from and all the languages that they speak. And God has, instead of mixing up their languages or allowing their languages to remain mixed up, God has sort of unified them and allowed them to hear one another, not so that they can do something great themselves, but so that they can come to hear and follow the way of Jesus, which is essentially to give up greatness, to release this drive towards greatness and progress and revolution, and to learn to love one another deeply and well, to begin to share their possessions with one another, to begin to live this life that is different than the life that humanity has made for itself. It's different than the way that we've made for ourselves, and is instead rooted in the way of God, where our core is not pride, it's not drive, it's not ambition, it's not accomplishment, success. Our core is sort of humility and a giving up and an open-handedness and a willingness even to lose our own lives for one another, so that it's not what can I accomplish, what can we do, how can we make a name for ourselves, either individually or collectively, and instead how can we enter into the will and the way of God, into the baptism of Christ, right, into the death of Jesus, so that we can allow God to resurrect us. How can we give up our will and our way? How can we find this new way that is a way of sort of open-handedness, giving of ourselves, generosity, a way of faith, in a way of just sort of being open instead of a way of trying to like claim and accomplish. So we're gonna continue on. We'll come back around to the Pentecost story, but one of the big movements that we see in this story is that the Acts story, the story that has happened in Acts 2 here, is a direct sort of undoing in some ways of the Tower of Babel story that can help us find a new way. And I think again that this story, like the Babel story, is not just a story that's history; it's a story that speaks to us now. How can we find ways to live together as followers of Christ that don't fall into this human trap of trying to accomplish, of trying to revolutionize, of trying to solve the problems of the world by, huge technological advances, of trying to sort of make a name for ourselves or make a name for humanity, or, how can we find ways to instead put all of ourselves into the way of Jesus, into this new unifying thing that's actually truly unifying on a spiritual level, not just in a level of, there's a way that accomplishment unifies people because everyone wants to be a part of that accomplishment. When a business or an organization achieves something great, all of a sudden everybody wants to, I was there, I was a part of that, I was a part of Microsoft before they were anything, right? And because you want to be brought into that greatness so you can put it on your resume and say, I was a part of that movement. But it's something that's rooted in pride. And I think the invitation in Acts is to be a part of something that's rooted in the movement of the Spirit. It's rooted in sort of something different, right? It's rooted in faithfulness to God. It's rooted in hope that goes beyond the grave. It's rooted in a release of sort of the way of death and an embrace of the way of Jesus, which is the way of righteousness and justice and life and hope. So again, we'll continue on with this story in future weeks. Probably next week, we'll see how it works out with guests. But hopefully that gives us something to go on. Acts 2, 1 through 13. Check it out, read it yourself, and we'll jump back into it next week. All right. Have a blessed rest of your week. Thank you for tuning in.